around this time for the Shakespeare one? So everybody's new, but you're all, yes, you did, yes. And so I'm much more on home territory with Shakespeare. I'm already nodding at we decided, actually arising from some of the conversations that we had last year, that American literature should be the focus for this year. And all of you are signed up to TeacherHub, presumably in some way, so you're familiar with this web page. We've developed it a little bit. I'm already having very sensible conversations with people about Victorian literature, which is clarifying certain things to me. I think at the moment, the most popular YouTube video that we have up on the YouTube channel, which we'll be talking to you later about, is on Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I think it's got 1,200 hits or something like that. So, obviously, clearly Victorian literature might be the focus of next year, so I'm getting a sense of that. But one of the things that we're trying to do through TeacherHub is just to make resources available on a website basis, but also through meetings like this, and really looking to you for information and feedback on what you want to see happen next. So what we've done this year, I feel like I should do a little annual report, but also a sort of heads up on things. We've added a few more videos. Last year you were interested, the people who came along last year were interested in American literature, and I'll ask Katie to talk about that in a moment. People were also interested in coming to see Shakespeare lectures on site. So this will be announced soon, but we're going to do the autumn Shakespeare visits again this year. Last year we had about 80 year 12 students come on site. What we do is, I think it'll be on a Tuesday again. They come, they get shown around by students, they sit in on 2 first-year Shakespeare lectures, they have lunch with students, and then they get a seminar that's kind of tailored for their year group on that text.
And staff
can come. Sorry?
Staff can come.
And staff can come, yeah, absolutely. They have the best time. They sort of just, can I go and sit in the cafe while you do? So that's been great, and we've had really good feedback on that for just the experience of what it is to have a real university day, and all that entails. So we'll heads up on that, keep watching the TeacherHub, because we'll be putting that programme out hopefully within the next 3 weeks when our timetabling gets sorted out here. And we'd like to bring more people in. We can sort of go up to about 120 students in groups of 10 across the term. So that will be happening in the autumn term. I'm going to hand to Katie in a moment just to talk very briefly about why American literature, but we're really grateful that the US Embassy and the British Association of American Studies has given us a generous support actually for some activities this year. So we have an English and American literature programme that launched a year ago.
First intake this year.
First intake, which Katie's very involved in and well fit to talk about. And we ran a taster day for year 12 students a couple of weeks ago, where we had about 35 students come along and do another taster day on American literature. So it's something that we feel needs a little bit of support. We need to understand America at the moment, I think, is one way of thinking about it. And also, we're pleased to kind of announce that we will be working up our American literature videos. Prue's going to talk about that a little bit later. I'll point out people properly in a moment. We have some on our YouTube channel, we've already put up some videos by members of our staff on context, so we'll be playing you some of that right at the end session. So you can see, I think, that it's symbiotic, what we're trying to do with TeacherHub. If there are things that you think we should be having a teacher forum about this time next year, please let us know, and there'll be a feedback sheet. There always are feedback sheets on that later on in the time. But for now, what I'm going to do is introduce Katie McGettigan, maybe to talk a little bit just about the programme, and also give you the heads up to Prue Chamberlain, who's joined us from creative writing, but with expertise in American writing as well, but who is tweeting and keeping you in touch, and very pleased to hear via the Twitter channels and the blogs, contacts that we run, of things that you would like to hear more about. So one of our ideas from today is that if enough people are interested, we'd quite like to try a trial webinar in the autumn to see how far people have got, if you need more support with texts that you have decided or not decided to teach in the future. Are there any questions at this stage? Great. Casey.
Thank you, Deana. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Just to say that, so the idea for the Teacher Forum American Literature, TeacherHub Forum American Literature, came out, I think, partly from feedback from teachers last year, that there were a lot of teachers who were interested in teaching American texts, but perhaps felt that their own contextual knowledge, their own knowledge of these texts was not as strong as their knowledge of British texts, that they lacked a bit of confidence. It perhaps wasn't something they'd focused on so much during their degree. And also, I mean, personally, as somebody who researches and teaches American literature at university level, I was very disheartened by Michael Gove's decision to remove American literature from the GCSE. I'm very anxious that students might not be being exposed to it, which means that I don't get students coming to university wanting to study it. And as Deana said, I think it's important that we understand America maybe now more than ever, but it's also important to acknowledge that we tend to think of British and American literature as things that exist in isolation, whereas of course they don't. These writers were all reading each other, they've all been commenting on each other's works, of being inspired by them. So thinking that we should study American literature as part of a holistic English literature education that involves literature written in English from post-colonial cultures, from America, from Canada, from Australia, I think is really important. So yeah, and just also to echo Deana's thanks to the British Association for American Studies and the US Embassy, who funded this as part of a broader programme of events that they're funding over this year, encouraging the discussion, the education about America in lots of different audiences. So I'm going to begin today, I guess, by giving you a lecture, which is quite a scary thing to do as an academic talking to teachers. Because while I do a lot of research, I'm not a trained teacher. But what I wanted to try and do was give you something that was hopefully both interesting for you, but also something that you could take back into the classroom. So maybe some ideas that you could share with your own students. So the title of my talk is Locating the American Dream, Context for and in The Great Gatsby and The Great Wrath. And I chose this subject because my research really, although actually not on either of these novels, is about the relationship between American literature and the way in which books were written and printed and sold at different points in periods of time. So to kind of broaden that out, I'm really interested, the big question behind my research is what's the relationship between the way that writers use language and the way that they shape form and the moments in history in which they're writing? So the relationship between text and context. And happily for me, that maps onto one of these are probably inscribed on your hearts, right? One of the A-level assessment objectives about demonstrating the understanding of the significance and influence of the context in which literary texts are written and received. And while I think it's great that students are studying literature in context, especially as I come from an American studies background where we think about literature and history and politics and film and art and all these things together, I have a few problems with the way that this AO is written, and particularly in this idea of significance and influence, because it suggests that there's a kind of one-way relationship between text and context, that texts reflect context in some way. And this is something that I see repeated in the essays that my students write. So they say things like, Fitzgerald's female characters reflect the changing status and position of women in the early 20th century. So they make these quite general statements about text and context that have a kind of one-way relationship. So that one-way relationship is this sort of image on the left of the frog in the mirror, this idea that we have this kind of real-world context and this text that just reflects it. But you guys all know that that's not true. That writers don't just reflect their historical moment, they engage in negotiations with it. They might challenge ideas that were current at the time, imagine alternative presents, express anxiety about their current moment, choose to emphasize particular aspects of a culture at the expense of others. And this, I think, is more like the second image, which is a kind of funhouse mirror. So you've got the context, this is the real world, and the text is a sort of funhouse mirror that produces a kind of transformed, distorted image of the context. So we need to look carefully about how writers make choices about how they construct these dialogues. But that approach still suggests that contexts are kind of real and fixed and stable, that they have this existence independent from the text itself. It doesn't really take into account the ways in which texts produce contexts, as well as respond to them. That is, in literary writing, authors are often working to define the context in which they want their text to be received. In subtle ways, they construct boundaries. They make spaces in which they invite readers to insert their novels, their poetry, and their plays. Or, alternatively, they might work to decontextualize their texts absolutely, to take them away from the moment in which they're written. So we might think about something like Emily Dickinson's poetry, which is almost absent of any contextual references at all. It requires the reader to kind of construct a world in which to put the poem. And that, I think, is my third image, which is a sort of these kind of recursive mirrors, where text and context work to create each other mutually, that we don't have this stable, fixed point of reference. So my lecture today is really just thinking about that reciprocal relationship between text and context, how contexts enter texts, but also how texts shape context. So that's kind of what I've done with the two terms in my title. So the context for is the sort of literary, historical, social context that we might bring into texts. And in context in, I'm trying to think about how texts themselves imagine their context, how they produce them, how they negotiate their own relationships to history. And really, I'm going to break this down into three sections. The first section, I'm going to explore the textual creation of the idea of the American dream, something that my students often just take as a kind of given context for texts and don't really interrogate. So I'm going to think about how we might interrogate that idea of the American dream a bit more closely. And hopefully that will be useful for anyone who's teaching American literature or thinking about teaching it, because the American dream comes up quite a lot. And then I'm going to move on to The Great Gatsby and then The Grapes of Wrath, discuss some different contexts that we might bring to those texts, some of which will probably be familiar to you if you're teaching them, but hopefully some might be new. But also to think about how the genres and styles of those texts demand different relationships to context. So Fitzgerald's emphasis on stylistic beauty and literary style, I think, moves the novel at points away from history and into a realm of the aesthetic, whereas Steinbeck's protest novel, The Grapes of Wrath, demands a close relationship to context because it ultimately wants its readers to work to transform that context, to change the world. Just one final note, Jenna is going to send you all the slides afterwards, so please don't worry about getting down dates or quotations or anything like that. You can all have these afterwards, and do make use of them, rip bits out of them, transform them in any way you like. I really don't mind. I'm going to try and talk for about 20, 25 more minutes, so there should be some time for questions at the end, and I'm very happy to take them. So, the American dream. One of the key contexts for both The Great Gatsby and The Grapes of Wrath, and also pretty much every other American text that any exam board sets. They're really keen, I think, on this idea as being central to American literature. It's also a concept that, from my experience, students really like, and they often reach for immediately to explain texts. It's about the American dream, they've said, about everything from colonial writing to naturalist novels to contemporary literature, that they will assume that things are about the American dream. But they often don't make any attempts to describe or define the American dream. They work on the assumption that it's always meant the same thing, and it's always meant exactly what they think it means. So they think of it as being a fixed concept, rather than something that's fluid and changes over time. What it helps, I think, to remind them is that the phrase American dream is nowhere near as old as America itself, and that it doesn't emerge in a vacuum. In fact, it actually, as a codified, defined phrase, emerges for the first time in James Trislow Adams' The Epic of America of 1931, which is a kind of popular history book, essentially, which is actually half a decade after The Great Gatsby. So that's always useful to remind them that if the American dream hadn't really been invented when The Great Gatsby was written. Trislow defines the dream in terms of individuals having a chance to achieve their potential, unhampered by the strictures of old world society, so the class system, being born into a certain position. He thinks the American dream is about a better, deeper, richer life for every individual, and a chance to develop our capacities to the full. The first thing I'd note is that these definitions are pretty vague. What does richer mean, for example? Does it mean more fulfilling, or does it mean you have more money? They're definitely two different definitions of the American dream I'm going to talk about shortly. Also, to note that these aims, Trislow Adams makes these sound quite universal, but in fact he's actually responding himself to a very specific moment in America. He's writing just before the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the Democratic Party, who was effectively the president who introduced Social Security, the welfare state, as a response to the Great Depression. And Adams was a bit apprehensive about this. He thought that it might ruin the sort of individual get up and go that defines the American citizen. So he's writing at a point, he's trying to define the American dream at a point at which he's anxious about its future, a point where the concept seems to be under threat. And that, I think, is something that we can see continuing throughout the 20th century. The idea that the American dream comes most sharply into focus at points at which it's threatened. And I tried to get something that would sort of prove my theory on this. And this is a Google Ngram. Has anyone used Google Ngrams before? Okay. What Google Ngram does, and you can just go to the website, if you Google Ngram, it will give you it. It searches the Google Books corpus and for particular phrases. And it gives you the percentage of the corpus in which that phrase occurs over time. So you can map how different words and ideas enter literature, enter textual production. So I mapped American Dream, capitalised and not. And I think what's interesting is about 1970, the capitalised version takes over from the uncapitalised version. So it's like the American Dream proper noun gets established then, as opposed to the maybe more nebulous unproper noun version. And maybe I'm just projecting my own desires for this to all make sense onto my graph, but it does seem to me to peak at points at which it kind of becomes under threat. So the Great Depression, just when Adams starts writing about it, we're going to kind of peak just after the Kennedy assassination and the Civil Rights Act. We get another peak around World War II, where it's being threatened from the outside. And it actually seems to go down in the Reagan era, where perhaps people were feeling more confident about the position in America and the world. We actually get less references to the American dream. So Google, unfortunately, doesn't go after 2000, but I would be fascinated to see what happens at 9/11, because I reckon there must be another massive peak after 9/11. So this idea that the American dream becomes most visible and most meaningful at the points at which it's threatened. And when I was Googling book titles about the American dream, you get, it's always in crisis. It's constantly in crisis. It's like the Requiem for the American Dream Betrayed. It's just all falling apart. So we know, it seems to be something that we know best when it's about to be taken away from us. It becomes most vivid at the point of its failure, which I think is an interesting concept to think about in relation to American texts. That when it's about to fail, that's when we need to jump in and ensure its survival. So the American dream might somehow weirdly emerge from its own point of crisis, but I still haven't really defined what the American dream is, and I think that is perhaps the point. Jim Cullen, who wrote an intellectual history of the American dream, claims that its power emerges from its ambiguity, its malleability. The American dream is such an important concept because it's meant different things to different people at different times, and sometimes even meant precise opposites. So it's useful, I think, when your students are thinking about whether a text is about the American dream, to think whose American dream, and maybe whose American nightmare. So to just think about a few of the ways in which it's been defined memorably, less memorably, throughout history. So I guess if we're thinking more broadly about this idea of the American dream as the chance to reach your individual potential, we could see its first iteration in the Declaration of Independence, 1776. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the self-evident truths that Thomas Jefferson defines in the opening of the Declaration of Independence. So for Jefferson and the Founding Fathers then, I guess the American dream is a dream of a freedom for self-determination. But I think the important thing about the Declaration is that the American dream doesn't guarantee you the chance of happiness. Sorry, it doesn't guarantee you definitely you're going to get happiness. It's just the pursuit of happiness. You get the chance at giving it a go. You don't necessarily get to achieve it. By the time we get to 1994 and Biggie Smalls, Notorious B.I.G., I think gives a memorable definition of the American dream in his hit Juicy, which begins, "It was all a dream. I used to read Word Up magazine." I'm not going to rap because that would just be incredibly embarrassing for everybody involved. Which has been taken since as a kind of the articulation of hip-hop culture, materialism, wealth. The American dream becomes about what you can possess. In wonderful 90s references, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis. When I was dead broke, man, I couldn't picture this. 50-inch screen, money green leather sofa, got 2 rides, a limousine with a chauffeur. So by the time we get to 1994, the American dream is just about an accumulation of stuff, which is very different to what the Founding Fathers thought. And I think it's kind of interesting in terms of The Great Gatsby because the recent film version, the Baz Luhrmann version, uses a hip-hop soundtrack. So it's clearly kind of making links between that hip-hop materialism and The Great Gatsby. I really like this quotation from Malcolm X, which is from his famous a ballot or the bullet speech that he gave. This idea, he even says, I think, at one point that Martin Luther King was having a dream and everyone else was having a nightmare. The idea that one person's American dream is another person's American nightmare. So the 50s, white, beautifully kept suburb, the family with 2 cars, that's maybe what we think of about as the American dream, but obviously at the same time that was an American nightmare for many black people in America at that time. I guess going back to Martin Luther King, there's a divergence between whether we think about the American dream as about equality and prosperity for all, or about the self-betterment of individuals. And those 2 things often can't happen at the same time. It also has a relation to home ownership and land, which I think is very important in, for example, the Grapes of Wrath, where the Joad family have been cast off their land, the land that their family had held for generations, and trying to seek wealth somewhere else, so they're forced to give up this aspect of the American dream. But obviously that land, the land that the homesteaders claimed, was claimed by the exclusion of native populations. So the claim to the American dream is underwritten, I think, by violence, and that's something else that tends to occur in American texts, the twinning of achieving ambitions and violence. So moving on then to The Great Gatsby. First published in 1925, so as I said, it predates the Epic of America and the definition of the American dream by about 5 or 6 years. Yeah, it's often seen to epitomise the American dream. So there's this strange sense that Fitzgerald invents the context in which his work has been read ever since. And I think in The Great Gatsby, the American dream is really a dream of self-invention. So James Gatz turns himself into Jay Gatsby. The American dream is the potential to make yourself into something new, but of course, in the process of doing so, Gatsby doesn't get what he wants. He doesn't get Daisy, he doesn't get his American dream, and he ends up dead in a swimming pool. So if it's about the sense of promise that's in America, it's also about the inevitable failure, that promise will never actually be completely fulfilled. The Great Gatsby is a novel that I think, interestingly, both demands to be read very specifically contextually, and then at the very end, as I'll turn to in a moment, attempts to kind of both create other contexts for itself and perhaps even decontextualize itself entirely. So it's set in a very specific time and place. It's set in the summer of 1922. In West Egg, just outside New York, Nick Carraway moves there after he's finished college to get a job as a bond trader. And Fitzgerald is kind of obsessed both with this time, but also with the notion of time. There's and the idea that he's producing a social and cultural document of a particular time. There's a really nice moment when Nick makes a list of all the guests at one of Gatsby's parties in a train timetable. So the idea that he's kind of pinning this culture to that very particular moment. And the novel is full of cultural references. So there's song lyrics, numbers that were being played at the time. Nick references those very specifically. There's the idea that Gatsby's fortune somehow perhaps is connected with the fixing of the 1919 World Series by Meyer Wolfsheim, who was a thinly veiled version of a real Jewish mobster called Arnold Rothstein. In this scandal, the Chicago White Sox, several of the members of that team fixed it so they would lose the World Series, became known as the Black Sox. So then I think baseball is really interesting because it's often seen as the sport of the American dream. It's a very working class sport. And in there, even before the novel has begun, even before the events of the novel take place, that baseball American dream has already been tarnished. So there's no possibility, I think, even maybe before the novel has commenced, of Gatsby getting what he wants. He's trying to build his dream on the back of destroying another one. There's prohibition. Again, this idea that the corruption underneath everything, prohibition has taken place, but there's still, liquor is still flowing. One interesting context that's very recently been brought to the Great Gatsby is by the literary critic Sarah Churchwell, who wrote a study of the Great Gatsby called Careless People that came out in 2013. Has anyone read that? Okay, just to make sure I'm not rehearsing things you already know. I think it's a really good book to recommend to your students, actually. It's a trade paperback, so it's not a super expensive academic book. And she, in really tiny detail, picks out all these contextual details in the Great Gatsby, like the songs, the people who were there, the real people they were based on. So it gives a really rich context. And one of the things that she argues is that there's a kind of backstory to the Great Gatsby, which is it's a murder case that also took place in summer 1922 that involved an adulterous couple being shot. And she argues that this is really at the heart of the Great Gatsby. It's kind of an unspoken context. And her argument is that once we realise that, the novel is not this kind of glamorous 1920s, it's concerned with the seedy underbelly. She says, if the Great Gatsby has become our favourite book about what we now call the American dream, it is also a story about knowing your place. It's about the brutality of forcing people back into their places, the cruelty of being found out. So, so far, so summer 1922. And then we get the ending, the novel's famous ending. So we beat on boats against the current, borne ceaselessly back into the past. But just before we get to that line, in this first paragraph up here, I think Fitzgerald changes, the entire context in which he wants his novel to be read. He broadens out. Rather than one summer, we've got the whole entire sweep of American history from Dutch sailors forward. And I think that invites us to see Gatsby himself in quite different contexts, as perhaps not this kind of figure that emerges in 1922, but a figure who has an older history. And one figure we could think about him in relation to is Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers, who was also a kind of master of self-invention. He went from being a printing apprentice on his brother's newspaper to being one of the signatories on the Constitution. And so any of you who've taught the Great Gatsby will remember this point at the end where Gatsby's father presents Nick with this timetable he makes in his boyhood. And to me, this is just a rewriting of the timetable that Franklin makes in his autobiography. So Franklin was in France, and he decides that he's going to follow what he calls the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. And he makes out this timetable. And Franklin actually succeeds about as far as Gatsby in moral perfection. He was not a very morally perfect man. But I think what's interesting about this moment is it brings up this discussion that we can have about whether J. Gatsby, is he a man of his moment? Is he an original? Is he the Great Gatsby because he's an absolute original? Or is he just the latest of an iteration of an American type? I'm just going to flick past this and go back to this ending, because I think that the other thing that we could read this ending as doing is not just moving into a broader history, but perhaps moving out from history entirely. So there's a moment where the sailors are kind of moved into this aesthetic contemplation, this moment outside of history. They step from a contextual realm into an aesthetic one entirely. And for a novel that's previously been obsessed with time, we suddenly get this strange moment where time seems to collapse, where the past is both the present, where the future recedes before us. You're going forward and you're going back. So I'm wondering at the end whether there's a kind of abandonment of context altogether, that the novel just sort of decides that it's going to move into a realm of myth. It wants to be a timeless fable. It doesn't want to be a story about its moment. It wants to be something for all time. And I'm going to move now on to The Grapes of Wrath, which is also a story that situates itself in a very specific context. The Dust Bowl and the subsequent migration of farm workers from Oklahoma and for other places out to California. So for those of you who haven't read or don't teach The Grapes of Wrath, it follows the journey of the Joad family, who are sharecroppers. They have a small amount of land in Oklahoma. the Dust Bowl, so this great environmental catastrophe, but a man-made one, a man-made environmental catastrophe that's caused by non-circulating crops, essentially ruins their harvest, the bank reclaims the land, and they are forced to go to California to seek work, where of course they find that everybody else has gone to California to seek work. Wages are being undercut, they can't make a living, and they're forced to move from migrant camp to migrant camp. I think this is a very important novel to be reading now, and I'm going to get to that at the end. So the Dust Bowl crisis is a context for the Grapes of Wrath, but also the way in which the Dust Bowl crisis was represented. These photographs by people like Dorothea Lange, you might have seen this one before, Migrant Mother, the Migrant Mother series. Steinbeck was working in tandem with those people, so he's looking at artistic representations and using those too. And the Grapes of Wrath has a moment at the end where the daughter of the Joad family, having given birth to a stillborn baby, feeds a starving man from her breast. So these photographs, I think, must have been very much in Steinbeck's mind when he was writing that. The Grapes of Wrath also has a very interesting structure in that it moves between chapters about the Joad family and what people refer to as the interchapters, which take a more abstract look at the Dust Bowl. And I think there's an argument that the photography also influenced Steinbeck's style there, because they had these photographers liked these kind of diptych structures, so like this Making Human Junk poster, which was by a photographer called Lewis Hine. It has this duality of the good material and what comes out of the factory. So that kind of dual structure, I think, was also something Steinbeck took. But when we think about Steinbeck and history, I don't think we need to stop at, again, at particularly the 1930s, because like Fitzgerald, he's got this impetus to move outwards, to move into a broader history. So in chapter 20, which is one of these interchapters, he moves from the very specific moment of the Dust Bowl migration to all the other times that California has been settled. He sets this migration in a longer history of displacement and resettlement. The violence that I was saying earlier underscores the American dream. And perhaps even goes before that. He goes back to Rome and the kind of slaveholding culture of the ancient Roman Empire, that America is just another empire in a series of historic empires. These contexts also don't necessarily have to be human. Steinbeck was incredibly interested in ecology. If to use the modern parlance, he was an environmentalist. One of his very close friends was a marine biologist, and Steinbeck used to go out on expeditions with him. So Steinbeck, I think, could be seen as one of the earliest writers of something that we now call the Anthropocene, this moment that we're living in now, where the biggest impact on our environment is man-made. So rather than the previous kind of geological eras that were defined by the Ice Age and things like that, the defining thing about our own age is that we're changing the climate. And I think Steinbeck realizes this Anthropocene in that he moves away from the perspective of human characters and into the non-human. So he talks about the land itself being nervous. He writes a chapter from a perspective of a turtle. He talks about other non-human actors, machines, corporations. So we might want to think about, well, what contexts are there beyond human history? Ecological history, evolutionary history, geological history, that this novel has a much broader scope, a much broader span. I think this is the last point I'm going to make about this, is that he's also writing in a longer literary tradition. So one way of reading The Grapes of Wrath is as a sentimental novel. So a novel that achieves its power by trying to get you to feel things, by trying to get you to feel for the Joad family. You will be awakened to your political conscience because you feel sympathetic or empathetic towards the characters. So the Joad family suffer. They really suffer. And I wept when I read The Grapes of Wrath. I think a lot of people weep when they read The Grapes of Wrath. And the idea is that you will weep as a reader and then you will be inspired to change. This kind of writing has a longer history in American literature. We could trace it back to Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which is an anti-slavery novel that's published in the 1850s. And Stowe doesn't really make political arguments about slavery. She doesn't say things like slavery is really important because, or we should get rid of slavery because it's about bodily autonomy or it's unfair. She says, no, slavery breaks up families. It ruins the family home. It's all about feelings for Stowe. Slavery makes people feel bad. and we should change it. And the trope of sentimental literature is that you have dead children. Dead children make you feel things in the most brutally honest way. So one of the set pieces of Uncle Tom's Cabin is the death of little Ava, who convinces her mother and her father that slavery is terrible because she has this kind of dying vision. So the dead child makes you change things. And I think that happens in Steinbeck too. And this novel is kind of bookended by dead children, dead babies. There's this very kind of matter-of-fact moment in chapter 6 where Tom Joad just explains how his ma once left a gate open and a pig got out and ate a baby. And this is narrated in the most matter-of-fact way. So I had to read it 3 times to make sure that I just hadn't got it wrong, that this baby got eaten. And then at the end, we have this horrifying scene where Rose of Sharon, the daughter of the Joad family who's carried this baby throughout the entire novel, gives birth to it and it's stillborn. And the uncle of the Joad family takes it down to the river. He's told to go and bury it, but he doesn't bury it. He places it in the river and he says, you need to go down and tell them, go down in the street and rot and tell them that way, maybe they'll know then. This idea that the dead child is going to change your mind, because it did before. So when Ma let the pig out and it ate the baby, she never did it again. And hopefully at the end, we will read The Grapes of Wrath, we will remember this dead child, and we will never do it again. Unfortunately, that hasn't really proved to be the case. I think both these novels have a particular resonance in the context that we're in now. The Great Gatsby is in part about divisions between rich and poor, the 1% and the 99%. The riches of West Egg and the riches of New York are bordered by the great ash heaps where these people live a miserable existence. The Grapes of Wrath, I think, gives one of the most moving accounts of migration that I have read at a time when we're really no closer than we were years ago to solving a migrant crisis. So if you haven't thought about teaching these novels, I would just say that I think they really do resonate in the context that we're in the 21st century. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
I was just thinking, because I'm teaching coursework on The Great Gatsby, so that's where you really need to quite get into detail and sort of be quite critical about context like you were in the lecture. And it sort of just occurs to me, because we always roll out with the American dream, and as you point out, it wasn't actually defined in that point. And I was just thinking, well, isn't that a bit anachronistic and really bad history? And you always just go back to the, like you had there, the Declaration of Independence, and then we sort of put that on the screen and say, well, there you go, look at those ones, and that's it. And I was just sort of thinking, well, it's 170 years between.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was just thinking, what there must be some research on what that, even if it wasn't called the American Dream, it must have been used different words, this aspiration, this American aspiration. I think it would be sort of very helpful to me to sort of think, well, how did they actually talk about the American dream before it was actually called the American dream?
So the section of my lecture that I had to skip over, a text that might be interesting to look at is Frederick Jackson Turner's The Frontier Thesis of American History. So he's a historian, he's writing at the end of the 19th century, and his idea is that the frontier is the defining aspect of what it means to be American. That what America's been defined by is this urge to get to the new place, to make it your own, to make your own territory, to build yourself up in the new place, so moving west. Yeah. Of course, when he's writing at the end of the 19th century, they've got as far west as they're going to get. They've hit the ocean, so there's also this anxiety behind it. What are we going to be now we can't keep moving further west? And I think that's particularly interesting in The Great Gatsby because it's an inversion, right? So the Westerners move east, and everything falls apart, and they have to go back west. So there's this kind of idea that Fitzgerald is, if the American dream, and I think it is associated with the frontier, I think it's the same ideology of trying to find a new place, to build yourself anew. I think that might be an interesting text to do things with. Yeah.
I was interested in what you said about this idea of displacement and, I guess, geographical and ethnic sort of displacement. In terms of more modern American literature, just because that's, again, my focus for the coursework, could that be seen as a precursor to some of the displacement in terms of the effects of society and the displacement of identity in things like, look at the works of Bret Easton Ellis and Don DeNoe and Chuck Palahniuk. Is there a link there, do you think?
Yeah, and I mean, I think the Grapes of Wrath and the Great Gatsby, actually, this idea of masculinity and displacement, which I think is in something like Easton Ellis and Palahniuk as well, of where do you be a man in America now? Like, where do you stake your claim? You know, is it on Wall Street in American Psycho? Is it, do you have, I mean, Fight Club is full of that stuff about, right, like we aren't men anymore, we have to become men, but then they don't. It kind of ends up collapsing in on itself. So I think that idea of being, the physical displacement, I think you're absolutely right, in novels like The Grapes of Wrath turns into this social displacement. And that is perhaps a kind of dark side of the American dream as well, in that even in the 19th century, Americans are starting to think of themselves as this kind of people who don't like to stay in one place for very long, like people who like to always be moving on to the next thing. But obviously the downside of that is that you're constantly on the move, you never put down roots, you're always kind of precarious in some way. And I think there's and in The Grapes of Wrath as well, the physical precarity of the situation is linked to an economic precarity, that they're moving because they can't get work. So yeah, I think that you can completely make those connections. It would work really well.
So think about that sort of dark side of the American dream then. Is that sort of reflected in the sort of cowboy images in Shane and Ride the Purple Sage and things like that?
Yeah.
In terms of this sort of transient figure who's both a positive and a negative.
Yeah, Cowboys is another thing I'm really interested in. So Cowboys, and Cowboys are always kind of being brutally ripped apart, right? I think in things like Shane as well, like you have to undergo this kind of horrific bodily dismemberment, and you save the town, but you could never quite join it. I'm thinking about the end of The Searchers, where he brings the girl home, and then the family door shuts on him, and he's kind of left outside. So yeah, again, this idea that the archetypal American figure of the cowboy is both needed by society, but he can't ultimately join them because he's working in this kind of moral code that means he has to kind of break the law to make the law, and then he has to be shut down again. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Anyone else? Yeah?
I'm really sorry that if I missed this earlier in the lecture, but you talked about masculinity, and there was a conversation there. Is there anything about the way that these two novels deal with gender and deal with the position of women? And I'm sorry that if that was part of that.
No, I actually have not talked about women at all. I'm going to start with The Grapes of Wrath, and then while I think about how it might work in The Great Gatsby. So in The Grapes of Wrath, I think it's interesting because the masculine world is kind of ripped out from under them. So these men can't work anymore. Their land's taken away from them. And essentially, the domestic becomes the setting of the novel. Although it's not set in a house, their home is always moving. So there's a sort of privileging of the domestic space and the work of women. So Marjode in that novel is the figure who really keeps the family together. So partly it's Steinbeck thinking through how do you be a man when you haven't got work, but obviously also how are these female spaces, domestic female spaces, also intrinsic to the forging of America. The home gets moved to the frontier. So the frontier and the home are kind of closer together than you might think as archetypal American spaces. So the masculine and the feminine space come together in Steinbeck. So there's a sort of privileging, I think, of the female role. And you know, the very end where the Rose of Sharon feeds the starving man from her breast is a very visible privileging of the female role. The Great Gatsby is more because it doesn't really have... Women don't really come off very well in The Great Gatsby, do they? Like, Daisy's awful. And Jordan cheats at golf. So, I mean, I think The Great Gatsby is about a love affair between two men. So I think I don't know where really women come into that. I think Nick Carraway is perhaps feminized and encouraged to take in this female role to Jay Gatsby, who also is kind of obsessed with his domestic space, right? There's that great moment where he's going to have tea with Daisy in Nick's house, and Nick comes in and discovers he's filled it with flowers. Like, he's obsessed with interior decoration. So I guess home spaces are interesting in The Great Gatsby too. But yeah, I think The Great Gatsby is fundamentally not about women. So unfortunately, that's all I can say about it. Okay, that probably takes us about to the end of the session anyway, doesn't it? Gives people...
For this session.
Yeah.
Thanks, Katie. I love, there's something really nice about this time of year when, like you, we've been training people, for example, marking exams, just to sit and listen to somebody else's lecture. It's really good. Thank you. I'm thinking about the road now.
Yeah, it works really well, yeah.
And